All right. I hate the voice that goes with this sometimes. All right, so good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to another Wiser series. We actually got an interesting conversation today. We're gonna venture outside of the perceived corporate borders, and we're gonna venture into the world of third-party vendor and supply chain risk. We're AWOL, two possible panelists, one that I know about, and we're missing Valerie. So if anybody's seen Valerie, hopefully she'll sneak in at some point in time. But meanwhile, we have the very Mr. esteemed Christopher Johnson with us and Daniel Stanton with us. So I'm going to shut up for a second because everybody probably knows me, and I'm going to let Christopher introduce himself for a minute, and then we'll hand it to Daniel.
Greetings. I am by background an IT auditor and security person. More than that, though, I'm a IT communications strategist. So I help companies get over their anxiety to implement new systems and maintain what they have to keep it secure.
Awesome. Thank you, sir. Mr. Supply Chain, Daniel, you're up.
Well, thank you, Chris Squared, right? So thanks to both of you, and good morning and good afternoon to you. So my when I was born, the name I was given was Daniel Stanton, but as an adult, folks just call me Mr. Supply Chain for the reason that when I look at the world and when I talk about things, it is always through the lens of supply chains and how we manage them. Chris, you'll be happy to know I'm actually a recovering IT guy. Early in my life, I came out of the Navy and I actually became a Microsoft certified trainer, and I was doing network design and a bit of network security in there. But then I saw the light and moved over to the business side, and I've spent the rest of my career really figuring out how do we put all the pieces of these complex systems together, and systems being combinations of companies and people and business relationships, so that we can get people the things that they value. And how do we do that safely and securely and sustainably and earn a profit in the process?
Gotcha. Yeah, there's some interesting stuff on that. I do love the Mr. Supply Chain monkey. It's actually pretty awesome. It's kind of cool. It's one of those things, as Gabrielle and I were sitting putting this together, it's like, we always talk about supply. I mean, we should be talking about supply chain. Let me rephrase that. We always talk about the supply chain because from an attack vector, I mean, it's typically one of the easiest that we tend to use. Very rarely these days will we walk up to the front door of the business, kick the door down, and walk in. You risk getting discovered, you risk getting shot, you risk all these other things. Yet so often, we hear about the attack vectors coming in from the supply chain. So it's definitely one of those we wanted to put this together and do this. And so I think what we'll do, we got a bunch of questions, obviously from those in the audience. Please, as always, I got the questions thing open, I got the comments thing open. We're going to go through the questions that we chucked up on the website. So for me, I think what I'd love to do is take a step back and go, okay, if I am a business and I've suddenly decided, hey, I probably should look at the supply chain thing, where do I start? How do I identify, where do I start? What do I do with this? I'm going to throw this at Daniel for a second, and then Chris, I'm going to chuck it over to you. So go for it. Give me the starting blocks if you want.
My simplest starting point with that is a framework that we use a lot of times in supply chain management called the Supply Chain Operations Reference Model, the SCORE model. And the SCORE model defines supply chain processes. There are three process groups: plan, source, make, deliver, return, and enable. Any business process that falls into one of those categories is a part of your supply chain and a part of what you need to be thinking about in terms of relationships and security.
Got it. Okay, so so here's a question for you on that one. A lot of things for people to write down, and this is recorded as well anyway. Where is that? Where can I find that? Where can I find the ABCs of what to do with this?
Well, there's a book that I would certainly recommend for people. So I'm the author of Supply Chain Management for Dummies, and actually the first half of the book pretty much is built around that framework, that SCORE model. The model was actually, just a little bit of the origin story on that, it was created by a consulting firm. The consulting firm actually said this would be more valuable if it were, outside of our firm and in the broader community. So they created a nonprofit and handed the IP over to this group called the Supply Chain Council. That group merged into another organization called the Association for Supply Chain Management. So today, the SCORE model is owned by the Association of Supply Chain Management, but the concepts and that idea of using these process groups has really become more or less a standard across the industry as a way of thinking about supply chains, designing information systems, and integrating systems within companies and between companies.
Got it. Okay. Christopher, thoughts on this one, sir? There we go. Gotcha.
Yes. Initially, two thoughts on it. You have to start with, let's look at who your suppliers are, where they are, and what are the alternatives. So if this entity gets attacked, do you have someplace else you can go for that information, for that material? Frequently, the answer is not so much. You rely on this relationship, so that relationship has to be secure. So if you understand exactly what your supply chain risk is by saying, all right, this person, all right, I have a redundancy. Looking at a supermarket example, well, if Kroger is out of it, I can always go to Target, or I have 3 in the neighborhood, I'm good. When that's a car seat, or when that's a widget,
yeah,
not so much. And you're as vulnerable as your most vulnerable supplier.
Now, is that a philosophy, to keep that conversation going, is that a philosophy that you can go to your supplier and say, where are you getting your pieces from? Where are you getting your raw materials from? I mean, it's in a small to medium business, I can understand doing that because maybe you've only got a dozen or 10 dozen of them. But when you start looking at these massive, I was talking, having a conversation with some of them, there are thousands upon thousands of suppliers. I mean, to me, it's like, how do you manage that risk? I mean, do you just take the top suppliers? I mean, how the hell do you manage that risk? That's a rough one to me. All right. Let Chris go for it for a second, then I'm going to throw it over to you afterwards.
It is hard to manage. However, you have to place reliance on standardization and audits. So as an IT auditor, I look for certain things. I look at the SOC 1 report, the SOC 2 report. I want to see how these things, how the risk is being identified and mitigated, and then rely on those suppliers to perform their own due diligence down the line. Part of it, I need to know where my liability ends. I can't be responsible for everything, before it gets to my door. The interaction between myself and that tier 1 supplier. Okay, yes, that's where I have to focus. If they need additional resources and help, great, let's talk, and then let's work with their supplier.
Got it. That makes sense. Daniel, what you got, sir?
Well, I'm going to jump into that point about where do you start, right? And how do you manage all of this? And, for the term supply chain risk management, the field supply chain risk management really hasn't been around very long. I'm going to say it's really within the last 10 to 15 years that this has become a discipline that companies have really put focus in. And we've started to build a community of academics and practitioners that are focused on that. One of the leading researchers in that space is a professor at MIT by the name of David Simshi-Levy. And David did a study within, I want to say about 5 years ago, working with Ford, specifically looking at this issue of, how do we assess the risk by supplier, and which supplier should we do where do we need to put our focus? Where do we need to invest our resources? And kind of the going in assumption was we're going to use the 80-20 rule, right? There's this 20% of suppliers where we get most of our material. Those are the ones that we need to focus our risk management on. What David and Ford found was that is absolutely wrong. And there's a great article about this in Harvard Business Review. What they found is if you actually look at it linking risk to potential impact on revenue, so value at risk, there were actually very small suppliers that could have an outsized influence on the ability of Ford to manufacture and sell large quantities of some of its most profitable vehicles. So really what that study blew out of the water, this idea of being able to use the 80-20 rule. It's not a good answer because the takeaway is kind of you have to pay attention to all of them, right? There's nobody that you can afford to ignore. One of the things that though does come out of that research is a different approach by focusing on value at risk. That then you can rank suppliers differently than just looking at dollars spent.
I wonder if this is so when we typically go into corporations or organizations and they're like, oh, we want a risk assessment and all the other stuff that most of them tend to want to do immediately, is we'll sit down and say, no, let's actually play Dungeons and Dragons first. It's way more fun and we can get away with it. And you end up having these whole conversations around what happens if I do this, if the tabletop exercise mentality. And typically one of the first questions I'm ever going to ask a company is, what can I do to kill you inside 24 hours? What would it actually take? And it's almost the reverse of that, because you'll have finance be like, oh, the markets, need to go to hell in a handbasket. Sales will be like, oh my gosh, that dries up. But the manufacturing guy who's sitting at the back goes, oh, just chuck a handful of sand in the machine and we're screwed. And you're like, ooh, didn't see that one coming. And all of a sudden, you realize that the machine shop that was on the corner that comes and services it every 6 months is potentially the weakest link. Back to your point, and you're like, it's not the truckloads of stuff that are coming in every day, because we can get that from 10 different people. It's Fred and Frida and Georgina down the corner who have known this machine for 40 years and who know exactly how to tighten the widget to make the bloody thing work again. You're like, yeah, let's have that conversation.
Can I throw in one other point that you made me think of? And I've never thought of it quite this clearly before, but in the world of supply chain risk management, one of the ways that we often look to mitigate a risk is by diversifying our suppliers. Exactly what Mr. Johnson was talking about. Having more than one supplier for the same part gives you some level of protection in the event that one of those suppliers go down. But in your world, Mr. Roberts, every supplier becomes another threat surface, right? Yeah. And so now we genuinely have a trade-off specifically in the risk space related to supply chain. So for material flow, to secure material flow, you want to have more suppliers because that lowers your risk. But for information security, you want to have fewer suppliers because you've got less threat surfaces that you need to protect.
Right, and it's a really, really delicate balance, which to me is, this is where it kind of gets into, how do I monitor this? How do I understand it? How do I understand the flow of this one? The monitoring for me is an interesting one. Chris, give me some thoughts on this one, because again, I come at it from a threat intel side. I'm just going to monitor the heck out of them, and then I'll tell them what's going on. But you get into some dodgy water there sometimes.
All right, so from a monitoring standpoint, I want to make sure I understand the question.
Yeah, kind of like how do I understand the risk on this one? It's tough. I'm going to challenge you on the SOC 1, SOC 2 thing, because for me, and I know that sometimes you got to rely on that piece of paper, but man, I don't even trust that piece of paper, because you get so many people like, oh, I'm just going to fill it in. Yeah, we're fine. We got a firewall. It's They didn't ask us if it's outside of the shrink wrap or if we've taken it out of the box, but we definitely got one.
Exactly. And yes, too much reliance can be placed on, paper reports. The monitoring, though, getting back to what Mr. Supply Chain said, it is the Pareto principle, but not the way, it's not the 80-20 rule,
right,
in the way it was described. It is, all right, what is going to take you out? What will cause the most damage in the least amount of time? That is where the priority has to be focused. And so those, it can be that small thing like the sand in the gears. But the monitoring, an assumption I think everyone should make, assume that you're always vulnerable. Assume, all right, with one of the topics I talk about a lot is password hygiene. Similar to dental hygiene. All right, what are the similarities? You need to change your toothbrush every quarter. You need to see the dentist a couple times a year. All right, from a password standpoint, yes, make a strong password. Change it on a regular basis and review everything on a regular basis. Why? If something gets attacked, and assume that it already has been, what are the odds that somebody is going to, wow, I just got in, let's go crazy right now? Or, I got in, let's sit back and see, ooh, well, that looks really interesting. I'm going to monitor this for, I don't know, 6 months, 9 months. We'll see, and then I can just cherry pick and take what I need without ever being discovered.
Yeah.
If you're on top of the regular, boring maintenance, changing passwords, monitoring security, looking at logs, reviewing them, actually reviewing the logs on a regular basis, you can stay half a step ahead.
You at least stand a chance of, even if you just assume somebody's always going to get in, you can at least stand a chance of catching it, to your point, much faster than that. The average is now, it's like 6+ months. It's ridiculous.
Right, and this shouldn't be, everything in a 6-month period should have been reviewed a couple times. If it's that vulnerable, how often do you check your chain mail? Well, when I get a nick. No. Check it before you need it to make you invulnerable.
Right, that makes sense. Yeah. So this is interesting because it brings up the question. I hear so often when we talk to a lot of the vendors, especially or a lot of the companies that we talk to, they're like, oh, we only want to deal with a big, like a VAR or a value-added reseller or an crying out loud, SIM supplier. Why has the brain's gone to sleep? The SIM suppliers or the MSPs. There we go. MSPs, MSSPs, managed security or managed, the whole thing. They only want to deal with the big companies because that's where they feel safer. But yeah, exactly. So that's where we go. Go over, Daniel. You're up because I want to challenge that, and I'm going to let you challenge that for the minute.
Well, there are a lot of different worlds that we can look at when we talk about security of the physical products and supply chains, right? And I think you guys tend to focus more on the security of information. My focus tends to be more on the security of the physical products, but those two are linked, right?
Oh, totally,
especially when you start getting into communications equipment, sensors, chips. So I've spent a fair bit of time working on the aviation supply chain, right? And the parts that go into airplanes, a lot of which happen to be electronic parts. It's been a huge issue for many years, both on the civilian side and the aviation side, of how do you make sure that the parts that you're buying on a government contract from the lowest bidder by law are in fact you know, not something that was shipped out the back door, made to look like something else, found in a waste dump, and repainted and blacktop to make look like, right? And in the world of e-commerce and online sales, it is so easy these days for anybody to put up a website, list a bunch of part numbers and prices for sale, wait for an order to come in, and then magically make that part and send it off, and then disappear. The website's gone, right, as soon as that order is fulfilled. This has been an incredibly difficult challenge for a lot of private companies and a lot of government agencies to work their way through, right? On the one hand, you want to get rid of bureaucracy. You want to make it easy for people to buy stuff when they need it with a credit card so that the government can just function. On the other hand, you're actually exposing the organization to risk by not having good controls in place. And it turns out, just because somebody says, I got a web page and you can trust me, doesn't mean it's true.
So I like my watches. I used to have a decent collection. I've started to get back into them again. And it was interesting. Perfect example on this one. So obviously today is Veterans Day. The other interesting thing about today is 11/11 is the Alibaba's version of like the Amazon, whatever they call it, Amazon's
Prime
yeah. So this is today is like Alibaba's 24 hours of lunacy. And I mean the statistics about what I mean, there's like X amount of million of extra people, X amount of literally tens of thousands of extra planes. I mean, it's crazy the amount of stuff. So I was wandering around Alibaba the other evening. Richard Mille does some amazing watches. I mean, they're crazy, the amount of detail in it, but they're stupid expensive, like stupid. I mean, the cheapest one, I think, if you can find a used one, is 60 to 70,000, and they go up to closing in on $1 million. I mean, you can find a couple of used ones out there for 3, 4, 5, 600,000. Go on to Alibaba, get some really good supply chain people out there that are selling them for anywhere from like about 100 to about 5, 6, 700 for one. And if you want 1 million of them, they can produce them in a month. And I'm sitting there and I'm like, this is just crazy. And I mean, you look at them, they look right, they smell right, they feel right, they probably work relatively well for an extended period of time, but they sure as hell aren't a Richard Mille. And this really comes back to this thing. Aviation is a perfect example. The 787s, unlike the earlier planes, the 787s, the carbon fiber wings that they use have tens of thousands, 10,000 sensors, I think, if I remember, between the pair. You've only got to mess with 1 or 2 of those damn sensors before you start grounding a fleet, rather than messing with everything. So, your attack vector just becomes so much easier at that point, which is, I mean, again, it comes back to how do you deal with the information? How do you deal with the risk? How do you deal with the monitoring? How much do you trust the supply chain and the vendor? Chris, you said something really interesting earlier, which was the education. And I kind of want to key in on that a little bit as well, because I think we as the corporation, when I come to you and go, well, I want to work with you, and you should be honored to work with me, and all this kind of crap that we tend to see. I think we need to come more humble pie and go, how can I help you get better? It's actually, Daniel, you said this a little bit. Chris, I want to key off of stuff that we talked about before we started. So I'm going to shut up for a second.
Well, education is key. One of the weakest links in any organization, in any supply chain, is the people.
Yeah.
I mean, all right.
And it's a balance, because it's time, it's effort, it's, oh good grief, I can't just pass the problem on to somebody else.
No.
And it's the
you
same
have to
thing.
make the investment.
Exactly. And I think that's the interesting part for me is, it's part of the reason we do the education things is, how do we, when we say, hey, we're going to do the supply chain and we're going to monitor it, well, that means we're also going to have to put effort in as well. Daniel, some thoughts from you as well on this one. This is more of a conversation with the three of us, I think, definitely.
Well, back to the focus on security, right? Because I think that's really the core of the discussion. having started off early in my career being a networking guy, there was a point where security wasn't really a big threat, right? I mean, the focus was on capability, right?
Yeah.
Early days of the internet, it was all about how do you figure out how to make this stuff work, right? It was only as we got to the place that this stuff was working pretty well that other folks, and things like viruses became a real threat, right? And now obviously there's a lot more. And at that point, security very much became a part of the practice of being an IT professional, right? It went from being something that maybe some people specialized in, and most people it wasn't their top priority, to today, you think about security as a part of everything you do in IT. It's just part of the tool set. We're not there with supply chain. Supply chain is still focused on how do we do this and how do we actually make it work consistently. I think we're just on the cusp of really needing to embed that education and that thought process to say, oh, you need to make sure that it works well, but you also need to consider the risks. And even though you may not like to think about it, there are bad people in the world that for whatever reason, whatever their motive, they are looking for ways to throw sand into your machine. They're looking for ways to screw it up. And so while on the one hand, it's great to focus on how do you make it work better, you also have to be thinking about the risks and resiliency and factor that in as a part of your design in order to be successful.
Absolutely.
Yeah, give me some thoughts on this. You've done the audit and the architecture process.
Well, all right, but moving it away from that and sticking with folks or sticking with people.
Yeah.
The weak link. So something you were talking about, or how you mentioned the education factor where we're not there yet. Everyone has a cell phone right now. There is a huge reliance placed on them. Everyone does not keep their operating system or the apps on the phone up to date. There's a huge imbalance. If you rely on this piece of plastic and glass to keep your identity safe and secure so that you can go into Whole Foods and perform a touchless transaction at the end, but you don't update the operating system or any of the apps, there's no point. I mean, you have high tech and high vulnerability at the same time. With supply chain, I think it's still that same thing. I think now people are starting to understand a little bit more because of this global pandemic. What do you mean I have to wait 2 months to get paper towel? It's just paper towel. Well, no, it's not. If we manufacture it this way, well, that's how we're set up. And now people are certain, oh, wait, you mean you have it set up to only run this way, but we need it to run that way. Can't you just switch it over? No, those are different machines.
Yeah.
People are starting to make getting that understanding. But again, the problem is the education, because just like with that piece of plastic and glass, they're not updating everything all the time. On the supply chain side, they think it's somebody else's responsibility instead of, it's like, hey, what can I do to make sure that what I touch and where I'm going is safe and secure?
There's actually a question that came in that really hits that home, which is, and it was kind of interesting because I was hesitant about the question, but when I thought about it, I'm like, okay, it makes sense, which is the question came in from DC. What kind of due diligence process do we recommend for like the free apps and extensions and stuff like that? And in essence, that's still supply chain. We're relying on somebody else's apps. We're relying, and this isn't, to Daniel's point, this isn't physical, but it's still supply chain because it's data. It's, Chris, to your point, I'm relying on handling my data or my access or my something, and we don't have. I mean, there's a lot of hearsay about, well, check the vendor or check the supplier or make sure that it's a known or a trusted, development team or specifically for some of us in the government side, I've got to make sure where the hell was the damn thing manufactured, and all those other things. And we don't seem to have gotten that figured out. We've gotten, and I don't know, there's so many areas we could go in this one. There's so many recommendations we could sit. I'm interested in the recommendations. So if we take that for an instance, let's peel a layer back and go, okay, we're going to put a kink in the supply chain. We are going to talk about my browser and to your point, the apps on this blasted thing. How do we do due diligence on the supply chain for the apps on this? How do we trust? Go on.
Let me throw in a specific example, because I'm a pretty concrete sort of guy, right? I like to have a use case to wrap my head around.
Yeah.
So, we can talk about where things are manufactured. We can talk about who makes them, but in the United States in particular, everything moves on a truck, right? Well, who drives that truck, right? That's a third-party vendor. Who brokers that transaction, right? And one of the in days gone past, nobody really paid much attention to it, right? There was a traffic or transportation group in the company. They hired a truck. It magically appeared where you wanted it to be. That was the end. These days, it's all about data, right? You've now got some sort of a sensor on the load. You're transmitting information somehow in your supply chain about who's carrying the truck, where the truck is located, when the projected ETA is. And this year, there has been an explosion of companies becoming digital freight brokers, including Uber. Uber has Uber Freight. Amazon has, I think they call it Amazon Freight, right? Mm-hmm. And so the way this works is a truck driver downloads an app. Somebody at the shipping facility downloads an app or goes to a web page. Somebody at the receiving facilities on a web page are downloading an app. Great, all of these people can access this information. But who else can now, if they penetrate anywhere in that chain, has complete visibility to what you're shipping, where you're shipping it to, what the value is, and exactly where it is at every step along that way.
Absolutely.
I love some research. So for those of you that know, behind the scenes, we run Hillbilly Hit Squad, which is a research organization. We do a bunch of other things as well, but as part of it, what we're doing, the research we're doing is actually back on locomotives. We're going back to mess around with trains, but we're getting really nasty this time. So one of the biggest targets that we're going after, because they tie in with the trains, is Cargill. And we're going heavily after them because they are obviously global. They influence the markets. They have their hands into many different things. And so we're starting to look at basically where, if we were going to be mean and nasty and cruel and do certain things and affect the supply chain, where would we do it? How do we do it? And then you start looking at influencing the markets. Then to your point, it's a software thing, it's a physical thing, and it's this entire, it's a spider web that you're right. We don't tend to think about it until the toilet paper doesn't end up on the darn stores for 3 months at a time. And then it's like, well, why or what happened? I'm going through now. I shipped some stuff from the UK. I'm waiting for it to arrive. According to UPS, it's sitting in a facility somewhere it's being shipped between Kentucky. It's been that way for 3 days. I can't get a ready update on the stupid thing. I'm like, we look at these things and we go, okay, this to me should be simple to be able to do. So for me, it's like, okay, what controls can we put in place? Again, if we take this a step back and we go, look, there are so many companies that really have to think about this, that aren't thinking about this. How can we help them? How can we help them understand? How can we help them take those first couple of steps? I'm opening that to either of you two to jump in on this one.
I'll let Mr. Johnson take it. How's that?
Thank you.
Actually, you know what? Let me break it down first. Wait.
Let me throw one other thing in there, because the reason that I was at a loss for words, which is pretty rare for me, is because you triggered actually something else that I think is really important for us to talk about. Because we are right now facing what could be the largest logistics and supply chain challenge that the human race has ever undertaken, which is manufacturing and distribution of COVID vaccines.
Yeah.
And so, you know, when Mr. Roberts talks about, if I were a bad actor, you know, where would I hit, and how could I have the most impact globally on supply chains? You know, we are creating essentially a massive new supply chain. I don't want to say from scratch, but we're assembling the pieces. We're putting the Lego blocks together right now, and we're doing it in a hurry.
Mm-hmm.
I gotta think a lot of the folks that are doing it are you know, in a don't bother me with the details, we'll deal with security later, who would ever want you know, interfere with what we're doing because we're trying to save humanity. And I think, you know, that is a community that is forming, right? People that have an interest in helping to make sure that we've got a supply chain to do this. And my hope is there are folks from this community, our audience, and folks like Chris Roberts and Chris Johnson, who are saying, okay, you know, one of the things that I need to be contributing my talent to in the next couple of years is building security into this supply chain and helping to protect it so that it can do its job.
Oh, I know exactly where I'd hit him right off the bat. I go after the what they call the reefer units, the refrigeration units.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, because, all right, minus 80 degrees. Well, that's a very specific temperature. So if you just raise that a little bit.
Yeah. We went after years ago, actually not that many years ago, a few years ago, we went after the reefer units. We were doing some work in Florida neck of the woods with some of their prized possessions that they're like shipping out to California on a regular basis. And the particular couple of brands of refrigeration units that we hit, you know, they update them via a USB drive that you can buy without any validation. They keep the monitoring stuff online. They have the sensors in the reefer units that are, you know, basically half of them are flipping internet enabled. And worst case scenario, you stand by the railway line and you just wait for the down train to slow down and you can just take over the entire thing. It's just, yeah, too easy. And we're probably going to use the same architecture to deliver basically life-saving drugs. And it's like, we don't have our shit together, let's be perfectly honest. Yeah, it's actually, here's a question. It's actually one I want to hit that came in from the audience. So if we take a step back from the doing and we actually look at the legal side, I'm really interested because obviously one of the protections that a lot of companies want to look at is how can I build this into a contract? How can I literally shift the risk? How can I move how can I dodge the bullet, or can I dodge the bullet? How can I dodge the bullet? A lot of it comes down to the legal side of it. I'm interested if either of you have seen, either from a compliance standpoint, Chris, or from a supply chain side of things, if you've seen more and more contracts be written in such a way where they're trying to shift more of the risk and more of the responsibility. I'm interested from either of you on this too.
Somewhat. But here's the big problem. If you get someone else to take that risk because it's in the contract, it still has to be enforced. So,
yes.
Okay, great.
Yep.
You transfer the risk to Bob. Bob is out of business.
Yeah.
I'm in the same place, right? I mean, I see companies trying to do it. There's not a surprise, right, that the lawyers are the first ones to kind of figure this stuff out and try and deal with it. But I think it's pretty ineffective. You know, the one that DoD has been working on. There's a new standard for what they call it supply chain security, but when you look at it, it's really about information security for suppliers to DoD. And anybody that's a government or a defense contractor over the past year or so, there's been messaging about, hey, you need to comply with this. And so the new DoD contracts, it's one of the 1,000 pages that you have to check a box and sign your name. And at the end of the day, like Mr. Johnson was saying, it's okay, great. Hopefully people are really doing it. But even if they are, if that's not enough, if that's not effective, so what, right? You can say that you've transferred the risk. The truth is, I think it's really more about acknowledging that it's a risk that we share, and we need to work together to to monitor the risk, because we can never make that risk go away. And so the only right answers are mitigating and monitoring and collaborating to deal with issues when they come up.
Collaboration more than ever. Even down again, back to educating the employees. Going back to trucks for a second. A truck today is significantly different than one 30, 40 years ago. A truck today is a high-tech hub on wheels.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think I just got a really nice message. Sadia just said, but if it's in a contract that my company has the right to come in and audit and enforce it, great. If you've got 25,000 suppliers, that ain't going to happen. And I think this is, again, we rely upon the legal chain. We don't always back it up. Chris, to your point, and you got a crazy amount of experience in the auditing and compliance and architectural side of things in that one. It's great having legal, but if you don't have the stuff to back it up, not just to enforce it and manage it, but also to educate with it, then it's like, why bother having that in the first place?
Absolutely. Absolutely. A server, hey, if you have that server locked up tight and secure, but anyone can just walk in off the street, okay, the server is really not secure.
Right.
The other one that we run into specifically was supply chain stuff, right? So it's nice to have the happy talk about collaboration and information sharing, and we're all in this together. Earlier in the conversation, we were talking about, well, okay, maybe you have a list of who your suppliers are, but and maybe they're checking the boxes, but what about their suppliers, right? Your second tier and your third tier and your fourth tier. In order to really secure the supply chain, you almost need, if you were going to do it with legalese, you'd need to have a cascading language, right? So we require our suppliers to do these things and comply. One of the things that they have to do is require their suppliers to adhere and comply. And one of the things they have to do is require their suppliers to adhere and comply. And in theory, that would be a great approach, right? You could kind of daisy chain it up the supply chain, and then you could audit it. What's the problem with that? If you are my customer and I do something to add value to a product that I then sell to you, why would I ever want to introduce you to my suppliers? Because if I tell you who all of my suppliers are, and you have a chance to go meet them and build relationships, at what point in the process do you go, that Daniel guy, he's a nice fella, but we don't really need him anymore, right? And so there are legitimate business reasons that you go, listen, I mean, if you want to ask me questions, that's fine, right? Within reason, I'll share information, I'll collaborate, that'll help us build a better relationship. You start asking about where I get my stuff, who I'm buying my stuff from, sorry, I'm whether it's legal or not, I'm not going to tell you that, because that's my business.
We have that on the assessment side quite often. When we run into clients that want us to do risk work or risk assessments, they're like, oh, we need the background checks on your staff that are becoming on site. And I'm like, no, well, we need to know who they are. I'll send you a bio. Well, no, we need the full information. No, because I don't trust that you can look after the very information that I'm going to hand to you. One, because I haven't tested you yet, and secondly, I just don't trust you. Yeah, and it's to me, it's less about protecting my people from being poached, but it's actually me trusting that if I hand you the data, you can freaking look after it as well as I can.
Absolutely.
Oh, go ahead, Chris. Sorry.
No, it is that trust relationship. But see, all right, looking at it from the other standpoint, in general, from the other end of the telescope, we trust too much.
Yes. Back to this positive, what, can I download more things?
Exactly. We willingly give away all our information. We trust too much and too often it's the wrong folks.
Yeah.
So one of the things that's happening, I don't know if you guys are familiar with it, but in the last couple of years, there are a handful of companies that have sprung up trying to solve this problem. So if you are, and I'll tell you, by the way, Cisco gets huge credit for being one of the pioneers of this field of supply chain risk management. Cisco has been out in front of it for, oh, go ahead, Chris.
So I have a question. Which Cisco? SY or CI?
No, the router guys.
Okay.
Yeah, because good point. Because I'm like, okay, the food people or the routing people. Oh, interesting.
Communication. So
totally. Good call.
And it goes back. I forget. There was the floods in Thailand, or one of the big disruptions that we had in Asia, sort of drove Cisco to get really serious about supply chain risk management. And then they did a really good job of sort of bringing together a community of other companies that were interested in this stuff. Coca-Cola's in there. Flextronics is very much a part of that. But then everybody runs into the same problem, right? I can figure out who my tier ones are. One of the challenges, though, by the way, I'll just throw in, is I may have a list of who my suppliers are, but the address that I have in my ERP system is where I send the checks. That's not where they make the stuff.
Right.
So I'm even knowing who they are doesn't really give me the data that I need to map my supply chain and understand my vulnerability from a supply chain perspective. But then the other issue is there's no way to get the data about the tier 2s and the tier 3s without essentially manually going through and asking and saying, please, 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 can you tell me who all of your suppliers are? But there are now a handful of companies. It's a new category of software that's emerged around supply chain risk management. And there are different approaches to this, but fundamentally it comes down to, if you can find either public data or data from, for example, transportation companies, and pull that in and do sort of a big data, artificial intelligence analysis on it, you can actually start putting the story together. And on behalf of other companies, say, listen, here's what I think your supply chain looks like. And I may not have 100% confidence, but I can maybe get to, I can tell you, I've got 50% confidence that this is what it looks like, automatically generating maps out of data. And then you can start to do risk management or I'll say monitoring based on incident alerts around the world, right? So you get an incident alert for a particular town in China, and you can go back to your customers who are big manufacturers and say, there are these 10 manufacturing plants that are likely affected by this incident, and we've got a 30% confidence that there are components from one of those facilities that go to one of your suppliers, and those parts are necessary for these products that you make. So
cool.
Go ahead.
No, that's cool. That was actually a question that came up that you're hitting on this one.
Yeah.
All right, so there's stuff out there that's doing that and actually doing the mappings.
DHL Resilience 360, Risk Methods, and Resolink are the three that I know of that are really out in front of that. Amazing technologies, but still very much an emerging discipline and technology.
Okay, so I have a question. That just made me think about incident management and incident response. Something that we hear about here in the United States. If there's an emergency, if there's FEMA brought in, the Waffle House Index.
Oh, yes.
So, go through that with us. I mean, and you're familiar, I'm assuming, with the Waffle House Index.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, so the Waffle House Index, as I understand it, is basically part of the way that FEMA measures the impact of a disaster is, are the Waffle Houses still open or not? And for those who don't know, Waffle House is a fast food chain that's very popular in the southeast of the United States, which is where I live, which is apparently where most of the disasters happen.
You're in Tornado Alley. I mean, let's face it. I mean, why would anybody live in Florida, Louisiana, Atlanta, Carolina? I mean, you're a bunch of window-looking lunatics.
Because of Waffle House. That's why.
We have one in Colorado. Come to Colorado. We don't get tornadoes. We don't get many tornadoes. We don't get
Robert, you're going to have a whole shift of folks now moving.
I don't want more of us here. There's enough buggers here, to be perfectly honest. But yeah.
I'll tell you one thing that's really interesting. I'm going to tie it back though. So I've been U.S. Bank does a quarterly index of transportation capacity and transportation pricing, right? Which is just kind of an interesting way of watching what's happening in the market. And with the COVID, whatever that was in March and April, when everything just shut down, you absolutely could see that effect in the charts and the data, right? Across the country, everything just collapsed. But when you looked at the response and the rate at which things came back, the Southeast outperformed the rest of the country. And when I was looking at that and trying to think about it, I wonder if part of it isn't just because we get so much practice dealing with disruptions.
Yep,
absolutely.
Well, look, here comes another one.
Right? Yeah. It's like we're drilling this all the time, and so we're able to recover when everybody else is like, "Oh my goodness, what is this? We've never seen it before."
Hey, so I got a question. It came in. I'm not going to butcher her name again. Sadia. Yeah, I'll figure it out. We're going to have a conversation offline. Yeah, SAH. Yeah. It's a good question. It's actually, and I know some of the answers. And the question is basically, is it possible to rate a company, something like 7 Diamonds Award, 5 stars used for hotels and restaurants? I have some of the, like Nadia. Okay, Sadia. Okay, got it. All right. She's sending me messages. I'm getting there. I promise. We'll get it by like the next 1 or 2 of these. I know some of the answers to this because, again, I'll give a shout out to Ryan and Evan over at Security Studio, which is they have the Security Studio. They've got an index that they use to rate and to do work with vendors and supply chains on stuff like that one. So have either of you come across like a rating scale or something that will help an organization? No, see, I think we're missing a big chunk of that. It can't exactly go through Google ratings or, flipping anything like Uber Eats ratings or anything along those lines. But I do think we need something that actually helps organizations understand more effectively, like who they're getting in bed with, to be perfectly honest. All right, Daniel, I know have a hard stop at the top of the hour. We talked briefly yesterday, so I got to get you off in the next minute or two at the very least. Yeah, go for it.
Throw in a couple of things. One, it's Veterans Day. Thank you to all of our brothers in arms who have served. And the thing that I always ask people is understand why we celebrate Veterans Day on the day that we do. Meaning it's not a day that we declared war. Thank you everyone for your service, and Mr. Roberts and Mr. Johnson both. I'm so glad to be able to have this conversation, for the folks out there. I hope that it was useful and interesting for them, because it sure was for me. So thank you.
It's gratefully appreciated. Christopher, absolute pleasure. A pleasure to be able to do this than just do the bridges and tech stuff on. Well, actually, that's later on today. Good grief, we're on Wednesdays. I'll see you later in a more relaxed, well, this is relaxed anyway, so a pleasure having you on. Thank you.
I'll let my hair down later. I'll let my hair down later, yeah.
Gentlemen, thank you very, very much. Absolute pleasure. Hopefully, thanks for everybody in the audience for the questions. I promise I'm going to get the name right at some point. I'm going to go practice offline for crying out loud. This one's driving me nuts. So everybody, again, it's been a Wiser awareness training. Thanks to Gabrielle and the team over at Wiser for putting this on. Hopefully we've had some fun and conversations, and we'll put something out on security awareness. As always, thank you very, very much, and look forward to seeing everybody again very, very soon. Thank you. And yes, go hug a veteran if they want to be hugged. If they don't want to hug, just, go pat them on the head and try not to get shot. Take care, everybody.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.